So Flagship's been around for 15 years. This just shows from inception in 2000 until now, we've raised 5 funds. This is the size of the funds, which in aggregate represent about $1.3 billion. The Fund 5 was closed just earlier this year. We're an early stage venture capital and venture creation firm, and I'll talk a lot more about that, focused entirely on life science and primarily on healthcare. So for most of what we do is in therapeutics and related things, but gradually and intentionally, we've been expanding into adjacent areas that build on the same technological understanding, but address different business needs and needs in society. The red dots here refer to companies that we've created within our Flagship Venture Labs, and I'll be speaking quite a bit about that over the next few minutes. So Flagship, we have a very particular approach to the whole world of starting and creating companies and helping them hopefully become successful. And what we're looking for is the intersection of this is supposed to be discontinuous advances and major needs. So discontinuous advances in technology and science and major needs in society. And the emphasis that we have is on building companies, on an entrepreneurial perspective, and on an aspirational mindset. Every company that we do, we believe at the inception has the possibility to become a very significant company with some sort of transformative impact on an important domain of need. And we try to help the companies think in those sorts of terms. As I mentioned, we are primarily focused on therapeutics, which represents about 60% of what we do. Health technologies, we do a little bit of diagnostics and tools, and then sustainability, by which we mean investing in areas where there's potential shortages, such as food, water, bioenergy, et cetera. We're very actively involved in the companies that we do. As you'll see, we actually are the company many times at the beginning. Even when we're not, we're usually the lead investor or co-lead investor. We're on the board, et cetera. And the team that we have is really not grounded in the investment world. And I'll also be talking quite a bit about that. We're really people who are interested in building companies, and we're all entrepreneurs in some aspects of our lives. There's a lot of focus on the importance of building a defensible core for the company, which usually has a lot to do with the IP. One of the things that's unique about Flagship is something that we call the Flagship Venture Lab. As you saw on the first slide, we founded about 35 companies over the last 15 years. And the Venture Lab is a dedicated group of people at Flagship whose only job or main job is to conceive and start companies. So these are not people who are looking at lists of technology or looking for deal flow to invest in. These are people who are thinking about opportunities and creating the basis for a company that comes out of those thoughts. So these are people who are, by training, typically MDs, PhDs in biology or chemistry or engineering, or people who have been entrepreneurs, have started companies previously, et cetera. And as I mentioned, we've founded quite a number of companies, and there's a very specific belief that underlies the Venture Lab and a very specific method that we've developed, which we are very proud of, and I'll describe that to you in a moment. But just to put this into context, how we understand what the Venture Lab does in the context of what other people do, and by the way, other approaches that people take to these things, as far as I'm concerned, all have their place, are all legitimate. So while I'm talking about what we're doing primarily, I'm not saying it's better than anybody else, I'm just saying it's what we do. So you often hear about incubators, which are really largely sources of infrastructure for people who are starting companies, maybe some lab space, maybe some backroom expertise, et cetera. Catalysts and accelerators, which typically provide small amounts of money to very defined opportunities, often in biotech, to basically take a compound and move it from an early stage to a slightly later stage. Angel investors who invest small amounts of money. Early stage venture capital, which is really looking for companies that have at least partially, if not entirely, formed and now are ready for some meaningful capital. Academic founders, and we work very closely with many of the leading academics in the world, who are often highly inventive, very creative in terms of interrogating nature and discovering what makes things happen. But we make a distinction between invention on the one hand and discovery, and innovation, which is putting invention and discovery into the context of some practical use. And that's not so much for many of the academics with whom we work, their primary domain. So what we do is a lot of original innovation. A lot of invention comes out of the venture lab itself, as opposed to just looking elsewhere. And we bring to it a very entrepreneurial mindset, which is all about trying to build great companies. Just briefly on the process that we apply, I think that often there's a few words that one often hears in the world in which I operate, at least. Venture capital is one of them, and part of what I want to try to convince you of is that what we do is related to venture capital, but we actually think is quite different. And then innovation is another one, and entrepreneurship is another one. Many people, I think, kind of have an image of entrepreneurs as driven, dedicated, creative people who operate somewhat in isolation, maybe with a small group of people, maybe on their own, and who, come hell or high water, are intent on building the next big company, often with suffering and anguish along the way. And I think that is viewed as, in many instances, sort of an artisanal process. It's almost as if the entrepreneur is sort of the business equivalent of the bohemian artist who's suffering for their craft. And our view is that there's actually a more systematic approach that can be brought to the entrepreneurial process that, if applied with discipline and rigor, can lead to very surprising destinations, and some that we think are very exciting. And so the intellectual process that we have is first to define white space. So this would be some area represented by needs, for example, in therapeutics, or advances in technology, or insights into science, but where there's not really been a dedicated effort to figure out if there's ways of translating that into value. And then we do what we call explorations. And the key to this is that we invert what is, I think, the more common approach to trying to figure out if there's an opportunity. That is, we say there's an opportunity before we know it's actually possible. And by asserting that reality, and then subjecting it to the evolutionary pressure of other people's critical input, we either end up concluding that it was a good idea and we go forward with it, that it was an okay idea but with modification we could go forward with it, or that it was a bad idea and we convince ourselves it's not worth doing and then we don't go forward with it. It's a different thing from doing that as opposed to going to people and saying, what is your best idea to treat cancer? Which elicits a very different response. What we like to say is that one of the most abundant commodities that there are in the world is negative feedback. People are delighted to give you their negative criticism when you say, I think I can cure lung cancer by doing X. They'll tell you all the reasons that that's a bad idea. And they may be right, but maybe they have missed something. Whereas if you go to them and you say, tell me how to cure lung cancer, they're unlikely to tell you their best idea. They're going to keep that to themselves. After we've done that iterative process to the point where we think we have a very specific hypothesis, we form a proto-company. A proto-company is a company in the sense that something is incorporated. We don't name it. One of the reasons that we don't name it is because entrepreneurs fall in love with their companies. And once they've started a company, they're very, very unwilling to say it was a bad idea. But we don't have a name for the company. We don't have titles for the company. We don't have business cards for the company. And the people who are working in a proto-company, if it fails, will not be out of a job. So it creates a bit of a different mindset. And the proto-company is there to test a very specific sort of go, no-go hypothesis. It might relate to some question about intellectual property. It might relate to a scientific question. It might relate to some aspect of understanding a market or what have you. That process typically runs for 6 months or so, overseen by a small group of people at Flagship. And if the answer turns out to be supportive of going forward, then we form what we call a new co, where we do formalize a company, we give it a name, we give it a form, et cetera, and start building out a company with more capital. And then when it gets to the point where we think we can raise outside capital, it becomes a full-fledged venture. This is one of the very fundamental aspects of this, and I think that it's a unique thing about what Flagship does, is that often the intellectual basis for these companies are coming entirely or partly from Flagship. So we've ourselves have filed about 300 plus US patent applications. We have over 165 issued US patents, and many of those become the basis for the company, or they get combined with IP from Columbia, Harvard, Rockefeller, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being that we're not sitting there primarily kind of waiting for others or sort of looking at lists and trying to pursue deal flow, et cetera. We think that this opens up lots of opportunities for us to explore directions that may not otherwise get explored. So, of course, a critical part of what we do relates to the network of people with whom we do all of these activities, and academic institutions are a critical element of that. As it relates to these venture lab efforts, though, what we're primarily looking to with our academic colleagues is one of two things. One is this critical feedback, and obviously the expertise that there is at a place like Columbia is such that we're going to get very, very deep insights when somebody says, well, that would be great if you could do it, but have you thought about X? And X, I believe, would make it impossible to do, and then we can go back and think about that. But just to be very clear, we're equally happy if some people from academia, and we're in the middle of a number of these efforts right now, come to us with their intellectual property and say, we think this is interesting. This often happens. We think this is interesting. We really have no idea whether it could be a company, although we'd like to know that. What do you think? And then we work with them to try to go through this process. So I think that the Venture Labs model is quite distinctive and I think unique. And let me just try to put it into the context of how I see more conventional venture capital. If you think about, and I'm just going to be talking about biotech now, primarily therapeutics. If you think about the main sources from which companies get their equity capital, there are public investors. These are people who buy and sell stocks. Typically, they're investing somewhere from high ones to up to 100 or more millions of dollars in public equities, which can be freely traded on public markets. And usually for biotech companies, those are in companies that have late-stage preclinical to mid-stage clinical products, occasionally earlier and occasionally later. There are private equity firms which typically only invest in companies that have sales revenue, and the private equity firm buys that company in order to rationalize its operations. And then, and I'm simplifying, I'm leaving out some things, but everything else is sort of often considered the purview of venture capital. So that would be companies from startup to mid-stage clinical trials. But the point is that there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in that. And so when people talk about venture capital funds, I think it's important to get a little bit more information to understand exactly what they're doing. Among the ways that the focus of different funds differs is that, on the one hand, many funds are primarily focused on companies that have an asset. And they think of the company as the asset, and it's all about moving that asset forward. That's essentially a project. It's a company in name only. And if you think about it from the fund's perspective, having a portfolio of asset companies effectively makes the fund like a pharmaceutical development company. Other funds are more interested, and this is a smaller number, in platforms. That is, technologies or insights into biology that have potentially broad ramifications. Many of the venture capital funds are really primarily interested in things where there's a reasonably advanced asset, typically at clinical stage, about to go into the clinic or already in the clinic. And then a smaller number that are willing to entertain opportunities that are much earlier than that. And then there are differences in the mindset of how to think about where you want to take the company. One often hears in discussions with venture investors about the exit. Right at the beginning, people want to know, what's the exit? How are you going to get out? We actually don't think much about that. What we think about is value. It's not that we're not interested in exits. It's not that we're not interested in making money. We are. But exits are an indication of success. They're not the sole calibration of success. And then finally, the classical venture capital model is a model where people come to you with their business plan and their team, and they pitch it to you, and you make a decision. The resource, the primary resource that you have at your disposal is cash. And you choose to deploy that cash to the subset of pitches that appeal to you. As I've mentioned to you, we're really trying to innovate through our own efforts and the efforts of those around us, and to get a return not on our cash per se, but on innovation. And that creates a very different mindset of how we think about companies. So this is meant to say that while I'm talking about our venture creation, the mindset applies to every company that we do, because over half the companies that we do are ones that have formed at some level and then come to us to ask us for capital. And I'm going to now just very briefly run through a number of the companies that we've been involved with, just to give you a little bit of a flavor for how this plays out. And I'm only going to speak very high level about this. Moderna is a company that we started at Flagship several years ago. It had been triggered by a publication from Harvard about using chemically modified RNA to hijack the cell's machinery to make a protein that would then affect the cell. We filed a number of patents around this in conjunction with the academics. This wasn't done in opposition or behind their back or anything. But those patents became the basis for Moderna, which is now using chemically modified RNA as a new class of drugs, which has the potential to eliminate the entire way that all biotherapeutics are made, tested, and used. The company, since its founding in 2010, and the company is still private, has raised actually $1 billion, about $500 million from investors and $500 million from corporates, and is moving quickly towards first test of this concept in man. Seres Health is a company that we started several years ago based on our recognition in 2006 that the microbiome was likely to be an important area. We actually spent several years trying to figure out how you would make a company out of this. Seres was ultimately started to create drugs from the microbiome based on the view, which we believe emphatically, that the microbiome is effectively an organ of the body, just like the liver, just like the heart. I was a physician by training, and I can tell you that as my training led me to think, bugs were bad and you tried to kill them. In some cases, of course, that's right. But the microbiome, a healthy microbiome, is critical to human health and has to be thought of as something that can be treated to restore the health of the microbiome, just as you would do to any diseased organ. Syros has its first compound in the clinic, which in early stage clinical trials looks like it cures refractory C. diff, and the company went public earlier this year. Rubeus is a company that we've founded based on the realization that one of the very best ways to get therapeutics around the body is to use what the body does, which is put them in red blood cells. And there's a number of advantages and benefits to engineering red blood cells to deliver drugs, and this company is early in its evolution. So these are all companies that came out of the venture lab. But as I said, the same mentality applies to companies that we've invested in. Agios is sort of a hybrid. Agios came from conversations with Lou Cantley, who's now at Cornell but was at Harvard at the time, Craig Thompson, who's now at Sloan Kettering but was at Penn at the time, and TAC-MAC. And the three of them in 2007 had decided to start a company based on their belief that metabolism was driving many cancers and perhaps other diseases. And this was really this was an old idea that had long ago been dismissed and was now sort of considered anathema. And they were widely criticized for their views. But we were convinced that there was a real opportunity here. And in conjunction with our colleagues at Arch Venture Partners, we spent about 6 months having put a bit of money in, elaborating the ideas. We then went to Third Rock Ventures as a third fund, and they came in about 7 or 8 months later. And Agios was started in 2007, fully funded in 2008. In 2010, did a deal with Celgene, which at that time was one of the biggest early stage corporate deals in biotech, where they raised $130 million, and now has a real pipeline of compounds for cancer and for metabolic disease, which have begun to show very dramatic results. The company went public a couple of years ago and is valued at around $3 billion or so. Editas is a company that we did based on gene editing and CRISPR technology. I'm sure everybody here has at least heard about it or knows about CRISPR in detail. We think probably the biggest technology advance in biology in the last 20 or 30 years. I think it's really changed biology overnight. It's a very exciting area with many challenges. You hear about it in the news every day. And we did this in conjunction with a number of other funds. Receptos is a company that I'll mention, which we did on the West Coast, based on advances in understanding how to solve the structures of G-protein coupled receptors, with one lead program for a receptor called S1P, which actually had already been tested in man and validated as a very promising way to treat multiple sclerosis and other diseases. The reason that I mention this, because I'm sure it'll come up with Oren, is that at the inception of Receptos, we didn't have the long-term CEO. We had an interim CEO, a very renowned biotech veteran named Bill Rastetter, but he was only going to be there until we found the long-term person. The person that we hired, Fahim Hassanein, is an exemplar of what a true entrepreneur is. What Fahim did was he built the company from when it was started in, I think it was 2009, and he came in 2010, to something with sufficient promise that Celgene bought the company for $7.2 billion earlier this year. And then just two more. Denali is a company that we were just involved in starting with Arch and a number of other people on the West Coast, Mark Tessier-Levine at Rockefeller. My background is in neurology and neuroscience, and Flagship has avoided that area for 15 years because of me, because we didn't believe that it was actionable. For a variety of reasons, we believe it's now becoming possible to actually think about developing disease-modifying therapies for diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And Denali is based on that conviction. And then finally, Torque is a company where a couple of people came to us, a Hughes investigator from the Koch Institute at MIT, and a great entrepreneur who'd been at Merrimack Pharmaceuticals. And it's using materials engineering to control immune cells. So it's a very elegant system where you can basically attach things to, for example, CAR T cells and significantly augment their properties, for example, to open the possibility of treating solid tumors. So that just kind of gives you a sense when I'm talking about thinking big in companies and being aspirational of the sorts of things that we do and how we get there. This is just, a couple of indicators of some of the successes this has produced. These are companies that ended up getting sold. These are IPOs that we've done just over the last couple of years. We've done more than that previously. And this is slightly out of date. This was as of about a month ago. The value of the IPOs when they occurred over the last couple of years and the value of what those companies are in the public markets now. And again, this isn't the be-all and end-all. It's one indication of success. We're very proud of this. But what we're really proud of is that it's our view, at least, that some of these companies are sufficiently exciting and sufficiently ambitious and sufficiently creative that they're leading people to think that some things might be possible that they previously hadn't thought would be the case. So with that, I'll wrap up.
I wanted to start off with something you mentioned early on, which is that from your perspective, you see Flagship as being structurally different in hypotheses and the way you operate from many other venture firms. And a few things jumped out at me that struck me as different than the way some other VCs would operate. So I'll maybe go that direction first.
Sure.
But in particular, around your venture labs concept, the way you explain it, it seems like a fantastic and obvious approach in some ways. And yet, it's not the way most venture firms that we've experienced have organized themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I guess if we had one of those other firms that don't have that structure in place, that tend to do more of their R&D essentially externally, are looking to acquire things at a later stage, what do you think they would say about why their model is different? Like, why isn't everyone structured the way you're structured?
I have no idea. I think that people are interested in different things. I sort of broadly outlined sort of a spectrum of sources of capital that are available to biotech companies. But many people who control that capital really are investors. That's what interests them. That's how they think about the world. And that's what they want to do. While investing capital is one element of what Flagship does, we're really entrepreneurs. Really what we want to do is build companies. We want personally to have an impact on patients and on society. And one benefit of that will be making money for our LPs and for ourselves, et cetera. So I think a lot of it just has to do with kind of what drives you. And I think that there's many different legitimate strategies for being successful in the world. That being said, I think that if you look at where there are outsized successes, those are typically where people have instantiated the potential for real disruption. They don't necessarily have to have completely demonstrated. That is, they don't necessarily have to take some revolutionary concept and create drugs and move them all the way through the clinic and get them on the market and sell $1 billion worth of sales in a year. But they have to show that there's a legitimate potential for doing that. And it's our view that the markets are sufficiently efficient that when you have demonstrated that to some level of plausibility, markets will recognize it. So that's a good way to get paid.
It must be hard to manage in a sense, though, because you've got, whereas a traditional firm, a traditional venture investor who waits longer waits for more validation, waits for the IP to be hardened, waits for a working prototype or a lead compound, would have the luxury of working on far fewer potential ideas a year, in a sense. They could have them be screened outside the firm. Whereas you guys have organized yourselves such that you're taking on more of that risk and therefore more of those projects. Does that lead to a different management structure for the firm?
Flagships is not particularly formal in its management structure. There's a small number of senior people at the firm. We've been together for essentially the whole time. So there is an informality, and I can't, to be honest with you, really speak to how that relates to other firms' management structures. But maybe one metaphor that sometimes I find useful, which would kind of convey an aspect of this, is I think about looking at the Sunday Times book review. I think that most venture capital firms are similar in a sense to the people who write those reviews. They are sharing their analysis of and rendering an opinion on what somebody else has created. I think that what we're like perhaps more is the people who wrote the books that are getting reviewed. And while those disciplines intersect in very intimate ways, they're fundamentally different. And so I think that we're driven more by that sort of creative process, and it allows us to come up with things without necessarily waiting for other people to do so.
So something else that we, so over the last few years, as I mentioned earlier, as we've gone from 4 or 5 patent-backed startups a year to 14 to 17 to 27 last year, it's fantastic from our perspective to see this new interest from the venture community in sort of academic stage, early stage technologies. It's very exciting, I think, for us and for our faculty and graduate student inventors. We get different perspectives from different VC firms on the role of the academic founder. So maybe if I could just take a minute there. There are some VCs that we work with that won't touch an idea unless there is a team in place, at least someone, a strong lead with a vision, someone with a vision and some operating capabilities who they can believe in and feel like they're investing in. And there are other firms that would prefer to build the teams themselves and would rather the idea come sort of strip clean of that. And so I guess I'd be interested in hearing Flagship's perspective. And also, from your perspective, what are the common pitfalls if we do have an academic founder who is really determined to be part of the company? What are some roles that you've seen work? What are some common pitfalls that those folks encounter along the way?
Well, as it relates to the first part of your question, I think that we are agnostic as to whether an opportunity emerges with a leader or an entrepreneur already in place, or whether part of what we need to do is to help fill that need. I think I would turn it around a little bit. What would be harder for us, or what often is harder for us, is when somebody is in place that we don't think is the right person. Because often the effort required, or even the possibility of extricating that person without having the whole thing kind of collapse, is not sort of a navigable path. So I think the critical thing is that the right person, the right team ends up in place, however that happened. As it relates to your question about academic founders, I mean, academic people who are interested in doing a company inevitably ask sort of questions about what their role might be, or whether it's best to put their technology into a company versus licensing it to pharma or whatever. And the perspective that I share with them is that I don't think that there's any right or wrong answer to that question. I think that there's an answer that's right or wrong for each of those people. There are some academics who really don't want to be in any way diverted from writing papers and advancing their particular area of research and so on, and teaching and doing the aspects of being a professor. And the other things don't interest them at all. There are some who really are keenly interested in the whole entrepreneurial world and what it's like to think about financing and intellectual property and all of that, and they want to be intimately involved in that. And then there's people in the middle. I think that a mistake is when people end up going down a path that's not actually compatible with what they really want, because there's some point along at which they will, I think, become uncomfortable with that. So I always try to spend a lot of time, if I'm working with academics, trying to be sure that they're comfortable that whatever the prescribed path is consistent with their own priorities, and then to operate accordingly. As a footnote, even the ones who are curious about the business world, most of those people still want to have their labs and so on. And so it's important to be sure that as a company gets built, that the company is cognizant of what the academic is doing in their lab, and vice versa, so they don't step on each other's toes.
So a lot of let's go with for the folks who both believe they should be CEOs and are right about believing they should be CEOs. So the ones that you actually want to work with. Assuming we have a few of those in the audience, is there advice that you give folks who think they've got a good idea and want to turn it into a startup about ways that they can enhance their experience and their expertise outside of bench research? Are there books you always recommend to new entrepreneurs, or courses you think they should take? Universities are putting a lot of effort these days into try and create a supportive community and set of resources for entrepreneurs. So it'd be great to know what your perspectives on those are.
I don't think I have a simple formula for that. Sorry. So I can only mention a couple of things which people may or may not find useful. I think sometimes people, as they think about building a company, maybe focus more on the details of the technology to the exclusion of the human element. And I think that often that proportion is inappropriate, even for a company which is effectively a project with a single asset. The people who are going to commit themselves to moving that forward and put the next 2, 3, 5 years of their lives into making it successful are the absolute critical variable. And for broader opportunities where there's a lot of uncertainty about what direction it would go, that's even more emphatically the case. And so I think that if an academic wants to be more involved, one piece of advice might be to really focus on the quality of the people that would be gathering around that, and that would be part of the group with whom they would work. That relates both to the actual skills of that group of people, and also the personalities of those people. You tend to put a lot of yourself emotionally, psychologically, just in terms of time, into a company, and if it's with a group of people with whom you're not compatible, that can turn out to be unpleasant. I also think that and by the way, each of us makes his or her decisions about who those other people are in their own way. So there's not a right or wrong on that, but I think you have to make those decisions. I think a second thing is that each of us probably knows about companies or initiatives that they particularly respect and think are admirable. Everybody talks about Apple as a company that's exemplary in many ways, and so on. In biotech, one would probably hear about Genentech or maybe more recently Biogen or Vertex or what have you, whichever companies you choose. And I think that it's useful to look at the positive examples and ask, are there lessons that one might infer about how they got to be successful in that way? And likewise, look at companies that didn't do well and try to see which of those can be translated into your own situation. As it relates to books, my answer is probably a little bit unconventional. I actually think that two of the best books, to my own view, that helped me think about this business were, one is a book called Genghis Khan and the Founding of the Western World. And it's not because Genghis Khan is necessarily an admirable figure in some ways, but he was, at least as depicted in this book, an original thinker and somebody who was thinking big and was driven by merit in certain respects. And there were aspects of what he did which I actually found to be quite instructive. Another book that I found useful is Moneyball, about sabermetrics in baseball. Again, not because of baseball per se, but because that whole approach was a very orthogonal view of how to understand the potential for value creation in baseball. And it encountered extreme skepticism from the entrenched group of old scouts who, felt like they knew how you would figure out who the next Babe Ruth or Derek Jeter or whatever would be. Now, it's turned out that sabermetrics has really revolutionized baseball in many ways. So I think it's the difference in thinking is the lesson that I took from that book, which I've applied elsewhere.
Genghis Khan doesn't have a blog, as far as I know, but are there any peers of yours or other writers who are chronicling the industry that you think that you follow or that you think others should follow?
I think that one group and one individual who has a very provocative and in many ways to me compelling view is Peter Thiel on the West Coast, and he's written a book, 0 to 1, and he's often talking publicly and so on. So I think that he's one of the most interesting. Of course, Warren Buffett has created his own path to unprecedented success. There may be very specific details of what people like those have done that are applicable, but I've always found that perhaps the most fundamental lesson from people like those that I find admirable is the independence of their thinking. And I think that thinking independently is a very hard thing to do. It's not contrarian thinking, which is actually quite derivative. It's independent thinking. Sometimes the common view is the right view. And so those would be two people to whom I pay attention.
So since we have a number of folks in the room who are interested in intellectual property, I'm going to touch on that briefly. Over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a real debate, as I'm sure you've been following to some degree, probably not as much as some of us in Congress, about the role of intellectual property in industry and entrepreneurship, whether patents are enabling innovation or hindering innovation. And it is traditionally broken down, or it's seen as breaking down largely as a battle between the biopharma industry and other long, high capex, long cycle time industries on one hand, and the software industry, the Googles and the Intels and the Microsofts of the world that are often seen as just wishing the patents would just go away. Mm-hmm. In your slides earlier, you mentioned that for Flagship, intellectual property plays a really critical role. So I'd first love to hear just a little bit more about that. Like when you are looking at a new opportunity, what kind of diligence do you do a lot of diligence on the intellectual property? How much stake do you put in the role of the early intellectual property? And then in particular, as a firm that invests both in sort of the wet science, but also is increasingly moving into this area of the intersection of life science and engineering, mm-hmm. With things like gene editing or diagnostic or big data, healthcare IT. Where do you think patents are going to play out in that space? Is this still going to be core for you, or does it become less important in those areas?
Well, I think that intellectual property is critical, but it's important to conceive of it more broadly than just patents per se, and also to be thoughtful about the possibility of getting patented intellectual property in the fullness of time that would be defensible. We certainly spend a huge amount of time trying to understand what the barriers are when we start a company, and then what the potential barriers are over time. Sometimes that has a lot to do with analyzing patents and patent filings and so on early on. Typically for therapeutic companies, many of the patents that are filed through universities early on relate to assays and methods and so on, which provide a starting point, but ultimately are not that valuable. Sometimes you can leverage those into significant non-dilutive capital over the first 2 to 3 years, which is probably their main value. But you really are going to have some kind of composition of matter ownership eventually, and you know, the whole therapeutics industry is fundamentally dependent on that, because people are not going to bet $1 billion to $2 billion of risk capital, which is what it takes to develop a drug all the way, if anybody can just copy it immediately.
And as you start to play more in areas where it's still related to human health, but maybe it's more about crop, you know, the agricultural side, or it's healthcare IT diagnostics. Do you still think that patented intellectual property is going to be as critical to your analysis?
We actually have largely avoided IT-based investments. Not to say that we wouldn't change over time, but part of that is because I think that the ability to defend those businesses through intellectual property, whether it's know-how, patents, et cetera, is significantly harder, and it's not an area where we're as comfortable. I think in terms of agriculture, more or less the paradigm that applies to therapeutics holds, as it does with new regulatory considerations and timelines.
Okay, so similar. So a couple more questions on the VC sort of investment space, and then I want to get into some career advice for the folks in the audience. There's a lot of, clearly we are in a great era for biotech investors and entrepreneurs. It's been an amazing market, both the public markets and the early stage investments. I know that Flagship has raised 500, the most recent fund was $537 million fund. The chart you showed earlier about the value creation in the public market space is unbelievable. It was like a $11 or $12 million value creation, $1 billion, $1 billion value creation delta, which is phenomenal. Similar to what we're hearing about in the tech space, there's a debate about whether we're in a bubble. Are these high valuations justified? Are they sustainable? So first question to you is, do you think we are? And if so, what's Flagship's perspective on what happens if the valuations change? Do you guys change your strategy, or are you comfortable with the bets you have on the table?
You know, I am very skeptical when people talk about a bubble and saying we're in a bubble, for a few reasons. First of all, nobody knows. That's crystal ball gazing. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the markets tomorrow. And nobody knows what the markets of today will look like in retrospect. So I think that it's a problematic concept for 3 reasons. One is, in addition to the fact that nobody knows, it's really something that explains what happened, but it doesn't explain what's going to happen. The second is that if you say the sky's going to fall consistently enough, sooner or later something will happen, and people say, well, that guy was a genius. He was the one who knew the sky was going to fall. Well, if he's been saying that for the last 20 years, then I'm not sure that he was a genius. And third, there is a self-fulfilling aspect to it, and one's heard that in biotech. But the debate in biotech, really is this the success just because of a bull market, or is the success reflective of some more underlying maturation of the industry? And while there's certainly short-term ups and downs, and some of those may be reflected in some of the success that we and others have had recently, we're in a long-term business. And so I think that if you're in the business of discovering and developing therapeutics, you're committing to 5, 10, or more years to play it out. And therefore, what happens over 1 to 2 years may have a short-term influence on your ability to raise capital, but it's not really what it's all about. I think that for a number of reasons, much more fundamental trends indicate that biotech, which maybe in previous decades was all about the promise, is now actually consistently delivering. We understand much better how to define patient populations to increase our chances of success in clinical trials and the speed with which we can demonstrate that success. Agios is a perfect example, as is Seres Health. The level of insights into heretofore obscure areas of biology, such as transcriptional biology and superenhancers, or the importance of the microbiome, are leading to a much more precise mechanistic understanding of various diseases. And then technologies such as chemically modified RNA and gene editing are making it conceivable on an everyday basis to do things that were simply not possible before. And so those, to me, are indications that this industry is going to continue delivering value. Jason did an analysis just recently where we asked ourselves how much of the value that's being driven in the industry is in innovative drugs versus other drugs, and what might one reasonably project over the next few years. And if one very interesting and I think important trend is if you look at approvals of the FDA over the last 10 years, you see an increasing number of truly innovative drugs representing the percentage of drugs being approved. And I think that's because social pressures are demanding it, and that's appropriate. If you extrapolate that and then think about the market capitalization that will create, it's reasonable to believe in the next 5 years or so that there will be $250 billion or more of sales driven by truly innovative drugs, not Me Too's, and that will create $1 to $1.5 trillion of market capitalization. So that's making very sort of basic assumptions about growth and so on. And I think that, again, there may be ups and downs, but over that period of time, I think society is going to continue to be willing to pay for the kinds of things this industry is doing.
So as that evolves, obviously, the venture firms are looking for the large biopharma companies at some point. I mean, it would be to get the drugs all the way to market. Often a path would be to partner with one of the large biopharma companies. And so, at least from our perspective, it seems like over the last 5 to 10 years, most of the large firms have created their own strategic investment arms. Some of those are focused, or at least claim to be focused, purely on economic return. So Novartis Ventures has made a point of that they are essentially a venture capitalist. They are not affiliated. Their goal is not to insource compounds into the Novartis pipeline. And others are more focused on identifying the next blockbuster and bringing it in. I know that various venture firms have played around with different ways of working with strategics, whether it's having the strategic investor as an LP in the fund, or even to go as far as to set up the so-called build-to-buy relationships, whereby the large biopharma has rights to acquire a compound at some future point at a predetermined price. I'm curious where you see that going. Have you guys? I know you've done some deals with AstraZeneca and earlier, partnerships with AstraZeneca and others. What's Flagship's perspective on working with strategics, and do you see that being any sort of best practices that you've seen in terms of VC firms that work well with?
Well, I think that every one of the large companies that's been interested in doing something has had its own view of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and then a number of the venture firms have had their views. So I think it's hard for me to generalize. And it partly depends on what the various parties are seeking to achieve. I mentioned a little bit earlier the importance of people and the focus on people and thinking about how to build the kinds of companies that we're trying to build. And I think that the very best people are usually driven by the belief that if they're successful, there will be effectively endless upside. Whether they're measuring that in terms of the money that they would make, whether they're measuring that in terms of the impact that they might have, the legacy that they will leave, however they want to measure it. To our view, many of the pharmaceutical companies' efforts to capture some of this more earlier stage energy, if you will, are constrained by the fact that they want to control it and they want to cap the upside. And I think that while that certainly works for certain types of opportunities, it may not be the best way to attract the very best talent to the company and to have the company operate in the most aspirational way. We have a significant relationship with AstraZeneca. We had one previously with Merck, which continues in our previous fund. And the conversation that we had with both of those companies was that we felt that there was a lot of benefit to Flagship of being able to have open, very open, scientifically driven conversations where we share views on the opportunities of a particular scientific concept, challenges, et cetera, with no buying and selling dimension to that conversation. And we think that they were convinced that our take on the entrepreneurial mandate and how you create value was sufficiently interesting that they wanted exposure there. In both of those relationships, the pharma company has no rights to anything that comes out of the relationship at all. Zero. Now, does that mean that if they came to us and said, well, we see you're doing this, we're really interested, that we wouldn't entertain that conversation? Of course not. And we think that the fact that they know a lot about what we're doing gives them some additional insight that may be a competitive advantage for them. But having sort of an open relationship where at the end of the day the market can determine prices in an unbiased way is critical to maximizing the value of potential.
Got it. All right, so I'm going to turn to the career advice part. So Doug and I share, we both were English majors undergrad and have ended up in somewhat unlikely roles given that beginning. Although I guess someone whose favorite book is as a biography of Genghis Khan, you might have inferred that Doug reads broadly outside the field. How did you end up deciding that being a VC was the career for you? And if you hadn't ended up doing this, what might you have done? People often come to ask for advice or what have you, and many of them are interested in how I got here. And I always hasten to say that I'm really reluctant to suggest that any aspect of my experience is applicable to anybody else, because everybody's an individual and they're motivated by their own motivations and so on. So I'll sort of make that as a disclaimer before I try inadequately to answer your question. I grew up with no exposure to the business world. My family was not in business. As Oren said, I studied English, which shows a real lack of business instinct. And then I went to medical school. And I can't really fully recapitulate for you the specific thought process that led me in the direction that I went. Perhaps because I came into medicine and science from outside, there were a set of aspects of the world that I didn't find were entirely fulfilled for me personally in medicine, although I found medicine very, very fulfilling. Just in terms of the range of people with whom you interact professionally, the range of issues that you have to consider in your daily decision making, et cetera. And then perhaps because I was in Boston and Cambridge, and it was already becoming such a thriving center of biotech, and even if you weren't part of that world, you were bumping into people who were part of that world. I think I just instinctively sensed that there was a center of gravity that was forming in the sort of startup world that had its own pull. And I guess I just got sucked into it. And I have to tell you, however, that when I left
my full-time job in academic medicine, I was interested in venture. I was told by people in the venture field that I wasn't qualified because I really had just a technical background. And I then went to work for 2 biotechs for 5 years, and I learned some aspects of the business and drug discovery, et cetera. Nevertheless, when I came into the venture business and I thought I had a reasonable understanding, I concluded very quickly I had no idea what was going on. And it took me several years to understand, to my own satisfaction, sufficiently what was going on to be able to develop my own view. And so I have to conclude from that it was either a matter of a really good instinct, because it's been a wonderful path for me, or pure luck. It's ended up well, but it was not a deliberate process, and I didn't have a plan going in.
Given the luck or instinct angle, when you're looking for the next people to join the field, to join the flagship, and people like Jason to join the flagship team, where do you go hunting for talent? What are some traits you look for, or experiences that you're looking for? Any advice you'd give them for how to break into the field if they, like you, have a technical background but not much else?
I'd say at the most fundamental level, I mean, it is a very sort of a matter of personal resonance. I mentioned earlier, each of us has to have their own way of judging other people that works for them. But I think that each of us also has some way of kind of concluding that's a very compelling person, or that's the kind of person I'd love to be spending time with, and that person maybe not quite so much. And so, keying into whatever those things are for you or for anybody in the audience, I think is a fundamental aspect of it. One of the most exciting things I think about my job, and I do think that it's a very privileged situation for which I'm quite grateful, is that on a periodic basis, I would not say a regular basis, because I think this is hard. I'm talking with people. Sometimes they're young people who are students who haven't published many papers yet. Sometimes they're senior professors who have big prizes and so on, or anything in between. But that person says something that is surprising, something that maybe even is so surprising that my first reaction is that can't be true. And part of the instinct that I have developed in what I do now is to realize that when that happens, that's the time to pay attention. I'll tell you that when my partner, Nubar, first came and started talking about the microbiome, I mentioned how I had a conventional view of microorganisms in health. And much of what we're coming to understand and believe about the microbiome is completely contrary to that conventional view. And my first reaction was, that's crazy. Maybe for a couple of diseases I could see it, but for other diseases it really seemed like stretching it. That's a time to really pay attention and say, well, if this is a serious person who's a thoughtful person, an intelligent person, and they've come to believe or hypothesize or what have you, something that seems so contrary to received wisdom as to be perhaps even implausible, there must be some reason why they've come to that belief. And so when I meet people like that, that's when I get excited.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question. If anyone has, I think we'll have time for a couple of audience Q&A after that. My last question, as a New Yorker, working in New York, a school that's been around a long, long time in New York, we're thrilled to see the renewed interest in the venture community in being part of the New York scene. For those of you who don't know, Flagship and Arch are part of something called the New York City, the mayor's office has launched, called the Early Stage Life Sciences Fund, which is a fund to invest in early stage life science coming out of New York. And Doug's been leading that effort. And Jason, you're based here in New York now, right? That's right. Why New York? Why now?
If you look around the world at biotech, it's really an amazing fact how few places have emerged as consistent sources of successful biotechnology innovation. You've got Cambridge and San Francisco, and Cambridge has, I think, really eclipsed San Francisco in the last 5 to 10 years and has become this unbelievably exciting place. I mean, it feels to me, as I imagine Florence felt in 1490 to Leonardo and Michelangelo. I mean, just so rich, so many people, all focused on various aspects of advancing this cause. And then there's some other places, San Diego, Seattle, RTP, et cetera. But I would say that across the world, the place where the potential, the discrepancy between the potential and what has happened seems greatest is New York City. If you look at NIH money, you look at Nobel Prizes, you look at publications, you look at hospital beds, any number of measures of potential value creation, New York is at the top of the list, number 1 or number 2. But if you look at great biotech companies, Genentech, Biogen, Amgen, et cetera, New York has really not been on the list. And Regeneron and Celgene are 2 fantastic companies, but they're a little bit outside of New York per se. And so that potential seemed notable to us. Then there's been, building on the great group of scientists and academics, a new group of people who've come to New York over the last 5 to 10 years. Tessier Levine is one of them, and Tom Maniatis, and Craig Thompson, and Laurie Glimsher, and folks all around the city, Eric Schott at Sinai, et cetera, who I think represent a combination of some of the most compelling scientists and big thinkers who really value the commercial mandate as well as the pure academic mandate. And so that seems like an interesting group of people. And then, of course, if you're somebody who is excited about thinking big, nobody thinks bigger than New York City. And so I think it's an experiment. It's an experiment that deserves to be done. It's an experiment that absolutely should succeed. But it's an experiment the success of which will require one reference company, I think, to emerge that gets people so excited and creates its own culture of people who start to understand building a company in this venue, that everybody starts saying, oh, that's what we can do in New York, so that we could be, biotech can emerge and start standing alongside finance and fashion and so on. So, time will tell, but that's what motivated us.
Great. Looks like, I see a hand up in the back. If you could, I'll repeat your question so they can get on the mic. And then introduce yourself and say the company you're with if you're with the company.
Sure. Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a senior at Columbia and I'm the founder of Kinos. So in the field of biotech, it can take years to be granted a patent or issue regulatory approval or do field testing and so on. So I'm curious, how old are the companies that you invest in, and how do you decide to invest in a company that's pre-revenue?
So to repeat the question, and by the way, Jason, Kinos is an interesting company because it came out of the Ebola hackathon that the engineering school... Design Challenge, sorry. The Ebola Design Challenge that the engineering school put together last year, which Barclay helped put together. So the question was, how do you decide how early a company is sort of investable, and when it's pre-revenue, sort of what criteria do you have?
There's nothing that's too early for what we do. As I mentioned, the starting point for many of our efforts is white space. So it can't get any earlier than that. So I think that, and every company that we invest in is pre-revenue. So that's not an issue in and of itself. I think that a few of the things that make something more exciting to us, one is something I mentioned a few minutes ago. Ideas that are really original, very original ways of looking at problems. Often, but not necessarily, but often contrary to received wisdom, are worth paying attention to. When they lend themselves to very mechanistic approaches to diseases. And when I say mechanistic approaches at the extreme, what I'm saying is an approach predicated on actually understanding physical interactions between abnormal molecules that trigger a pathologic process and are targetable therapeutically. That level of mechanistic understanding and the ability then to define patient populations with real precision, or likewise, technologies which actually make it possible to do things that had previously been impossible or extremely difficult. And CRISPR is a classic example of that. And then, part of our whole exploration and proto company, or our diligence, if it's an established company, of course, is reaching out to our network of people. And there's many benefits to that. As I said, we'll get a lot of negative input because people are very free with that, or other insights. The most compelling ideas often trigger an additional reaction, which is that other good people say, and by the way, is there any way I can get involved? And if people whom I otherwise respect, when they're exposed to a new idea, are drawn to actually want to commit themselves to it by reputation, by time, by money, whatever it is, that's another interesting calibration. And so, the other reason that that's important is because as one becomes convinced that you can kind of build that sort of A+ group of people around an idea, then you start to become comfortable that all of the questions that are not yet answerable, that uncertainty is acceptable, because good people tend to have good insights and so on.
Great. I'm going to go right here. Well, I'll do your question afterwards, and then we'll call it a day. Great.
Hi, I'm Taiwan Kim. I'm at the faculty at the Columbia Medical Center, actually working on CNS drug discovery. My question is it's very practical, although I really want to ask sort of a big picture question of Genghis-Khan. But your venture level approach seems to be kind of motivated for the big winners, big spirit, things like that. But in the real world, your LP might be very scared of the risk, and your management fee might be enough to run all those operations in patent filing. And I was very impressed that you actually did this model way back then.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really impressed with that. And how you manage all that limitations that others sort of, there's major limitations with why other people cannot do, although they don't have enough talent. But, I'd love to hear your history, how you manage, the time that when people are not as well educated as today's world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As far as the LPs go, there's probably a bit of a self-selection process because we've always been very clear with potential investors that that's what we're doing. And so a lot of investors might say, it's not for us, and that's not the people who've invested in our funds. It is true, however, that particularly for the first decade of the century, I'd say we were viewed with pretty intense skepticism by many of the people in the venture business. I don't have a precise answer to your question, except to say that on the one hand, you kind of have to do what you believe, and we all make trade-offs and compromises because that's the nature of life. But we have very strong conviction that this is actually the best way to create value, that it's the best way to make a difference, and it's absolutely the only thing that we want to do. So we just sort of said, we're going to keep iterating this to try to optimize it and get it to a point where it's working. But the core conviction has really been unchanged from the first day.
Great. Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, my name is Andy, I'm an MD PhD student here. So I was just wondering, what do you think about drug pricing in the US? Because recently there's a lot of talk about drug pricing, and then, yeah, we have all those great innovations, like the US isn't paid, then we make money. So when do you think the US is going to stop paying more for those drugs?
So just to repeat the question, essentially boils down to the balance between high drug pricing, which incentivizes the innovation to get the drug to market, and high drug pricing, which causes increased cost to the US healthcare system, both to the patients and to the insurers, and sort of where do you see that? Is there a tipping point where that becomes more problematic than it is?
So I think it's an essential question, sort of hanging over our entire industry, from startups and investors to pharmaceutical companies and everybody in between. And I would say that it is probably the single biggest risk over some long period of time that we have to confront. I think it's a nuanced problem, and that doesn't typically get captured in much of the public discourse. On the one hand, there are very legitimate criticisms of what a lot of the industry has done over the years, making the sixth of X type of drug, and so on. And does society really need that? And certainly should society pay very much for that? Particularly given that many of the drugs, particularly widely used primary care type blockbuster drugs, only work in 30% of the people who take them. That's really inexcusable. And I think that also, and it's extremely frustrating, that the industry itself has in many ways done itself a disservice by failing to communicate the value of what we do. I really am hard put to identify any other industry that contributes as much to the well-being of society as the pharmaceutical industry. But that seems to kind of get lost in the debate. I think that there is a risk, and I frankly think that the comments of people like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are irresponsible, and I would say that if they were in this room, and show a lack of understanding of the nature of the contribution, the kinds of risks that are taken, et cetera. But I do think that there's that there is a significant onus on all of us who are kind of collectively working in this area in two regards. One way that you solve the only 30% of patients respond problem is by doing what I mentioned in the context of the earlier question. As you begin precisely to understand a disease, and therefore you're treating a homogeneous group of patients who all have the same problem, then the number of patients who are responding goes way up. The classic example of this is antibiotics. But what you're starting to see is in cancer, and this was first with Gleevec, and then with Herceptin, and now with a number of other drugs that are coming forward. And that paradigm has to be maintained with absolute discipline and rigor. And so what people have a hard time with that, I think, is that there are some diseases where we're just not there yet. They're still really syndromes. There's some collection of diseases that are poorly understood, and so we try to treat syndromes. There's all kinds of heterogeneity. But the other thing is that, and this maybe is partly to your question, we have to be willing to take sufficient innovation risk that if there is success, it's going to mean something to people. The worst thing that we can do is to develop a drug successfully, it hit its endpoint, the p-value was acceptable, et cetera, and have nobody care. So maybe I can finish sort of on a personal note because I'm very passionate about this. I was a doctor in the 80s and 90s. And when I was a medical intern, AIDS had just started to become widely prevalent, as an example. And I can't tell you the number of people who died in front of my eyes with AIDS, with no hope. Multiple sclerosis, congestive heart failure, rheumatoid arthritis, many forms of cancer. These were hopeless problems. Now you fast forward to 2015. AIDS is a treatable disease. Multiple sclerosis is pretty treatable disease. Coronary artery bypass is almost never done now because we've gotten much better approaches. And you can go down the list. It would be a shame if society decided to turn its back on that contribution to people's welfare for short-term, politically motivated, very shallow economic rationales. It is true that we're paying for the pharmaceutical innovation around the world, and that's just a burden that I think we have to accept. So I think as long as we hold ourselves up to a meaningful standard of innovation and impact, then we should be able to continue to command significant prices for drugs that are completely justified.
So we are out of time. I'd like to please join me in thanking Doug for his time today.